Big shifts in global power rarely arrive with sirens or breaking news banners. More often, they slip into place quietly through balance sheets, settlement systems, and technical changes that only a handful of people notice at first. By the time the headlines catch up, the real decision has already been made. What unfolded in late 2025 and early 2026 was one of those moments. A financial realignment disguised as a security crisis, where the true battlefield wasn't land or airspace, but money itself. History doesn't always announce itself with fireballs or speeches. Sometimes it begins in silence, hidden inside a ledger update, a procedural tweak that never earns a headline. January 2026 was one of those inflection points. Publicly, the story was familiar and convenient: terrorism, instability, national security. But underneath that surface narrative, something far more destabilizing had already happened. Capital had shifted, energy flows had been rerouted, and the US dollar had quietly lost its seat at the table. At exactly midnight Beijing time on January 1st, 2026, China flipped a switch that most of the world barely noticed. The digital yuan was upgraded to carry interest. Until that moment, it behaved like digital cash, useful for settling transactions, but financially passive. After that moment, it became something entirely different, a yield-bearing monetary instrument, digital deposits, not just digital money. 48 hours later, at 2 a.m., Venezuelan time on January 3rd, the United States launched Operation Absolute Resolve. Over 150 aircraft mobilized. A sitting president was detained. The largest naval deployment ever seen in the modern Western Hemisphere moved into position. The official justification was terrorism. The transaction record points elsewhere. By December 2025, Venezuela had effectively erased the US dollar from nearly all of its oil trade. This wasn't a slow transition or a symbolic diversification. It was a clean structural break. Roughly 746,000 barrels of oil per day were being shipped to China, settled not in dollars, but through a mix of tether stablecoin, Yuan-based payments, and oil-for-debt agreements. Venezuela, home to more than 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest on Earth, had stepped fully outside the Petrodollar system. Washington reacted immediately. In November 2025, Venezuelan oil exports peaked near 921,000 barrels per day. After the U.S. announced a naval blockade in December, exports plunged to around 500,000 barrels per day. But the critical shift happened before that collapse. Prior to the blockade, nearly 80% of Venezuela's oil was flowing to China. In November alone, that meant roughly 746,000 barrels per day. And it wasn't just the volume that mattered, it was how China was paying. By late 2025, PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, was receiving close to 80% of its oil revenue in USDT, Tether's dollar-pegged stablecoin. Not physical dollars, not even direct yuan transfers. Cryptocurrency. At prevailing prices, Venezuela was generating approximately $50 to $60 million per day in oil revenue, nearly $20 billion annually at peak output. About $40 million per day of that income was settling entirely outside the U.S. banking system. That mattered for three fundamental reasons. First, sanctions enforcement unraveled. USDT transactions bypassed SWIFT, correspondent banks, and any institution under U.S. Treasury jurisdiction. There was no central choke point to freeze, no intermediary to threaten. Second, settlement became instantaneous. Crypto removed multi-day wire delays and eliminated the ever-present risk of funds being frozen mid-transfer, a routine hazard for sanctioned states. Third, transparency vanished. Through blockchain layering and obfuscation, identifying ultimate beneficiaries in real time became nearly impossible. Venezuelan banks and exchanges converted USDT domestically, but tracing the full payment chain from Chinese buyers to final accounts was no longer feasible. This system didn't emerge overnight. PDVSA began testing USDT settlements in 2023. By early 2024, new spot market buyers were required to transact through USDT wallets. By mid-2024, Venezuela's central bank was selling more than $100 million worth of cryptocurrency to domestic markets each month. By December 2025, roughly 80% of oil revenue flowed through crypto rails. But crypto was only one layer of a much broader strategy. Since 2017, Venezuela had officially priced its oil in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars. Weekly benchmark prices published by the Ministry of Petroleum were denominated in yuan, not as an alternative but as the primary reference. Payments moved through three main channels. The first was China's Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS, which by 2022 linked over 3,800 banks across 103 countries and processed large-scale transactions entirely outside SWIFT. The second channel involved direct bilateral settlement between Venezuelan and Chinese state banks, cutting out Western intermediaries altogether. The third was oil for loan repayment. Since 2007, China had extended more than $60 billion in credit to Venezuela. By late 2025, around $12 billion remained outstanding, repaid not with cash, but with crude deliveries at pre-negotiated prices, carrying $0 exposure. Even U.S. companies still operating in Venezuela adapted. Chevron, the only American oil major remaining under special licenses, did not transfer cash. Roughly half of its joint venture production was allocated directly to Chevron as repayment for PDVSA's unpaid debts, no royalties, no taxes, no direct payments to the Maduro government. In November 2025 alone, Chevron exported about 150,000 barrels per day to U.S. refineries under this debt-for-oil arrangement. Not $1 changed hands. Old-fashioned barter also returned. In November 2025, Venezuela imported roughly 419,000 barrels of Russian naphtha to dilute its extra-heavy crude. Payment was handled through direct commodity exchange. No banks, no currency, no sanctions leverage. By December 2025, just days before the U.S. operation, Venezuela's oil settlement structure looked like this: approximately 70 to 80% in USDT, 10 to 15% in direct Yuan payments, 5 to 10% through oil for debt mechanisms, about 5% via barter, and roughly 1% in US dollars. The world's largest oil reserves had nearly erased the dollar from their trade. Then came January 1st, 2026. China's decision to make the digital yuan interest-bearing changed the calculus overnight. What had been a neutral settlement medium became an income-generating asset. Oil exporters could now earn yield simply by holding yuan balances. At the same time, the yuan was already strengthening. On December 24, 2025, offshore yuan broke below 7.0 per dollar for the first time in 15 months. Over the year, it appreciated roughly 4 to 5% against the dollar, its strongest performance since 2020. At the same moment, China's multi-central bank digital currency bridge reached operational maturity. By early 2025, 23 central banks, including Saudi Arabia, were actively testing the system. Settlement times fell from days to seconds. Transaction costs dropped by up to 75%. Correspondent banking, the backbone of U.S. sanctions enforcement, was removed entirely. Each country retained sovereign control. Then quietly, in October 2024, the Bank for International Settlements withdrew from the project. Western oversight disappeared. The sequence is impossible to ignore. December 24th, the yuan strengthens. January 1st, digital yuan begins paying interest. January 3rd, military force is deployed. U.S. officials were unusually direct. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the blockade of sanctioned oil tankers would remain until U.S. national interests were satisfied, not humanitarian goals, not democratic reform, economic leverage. The same day, Rubio described the Western Hemisphere as U.S. territory that would not be allowed to serve as an operational base for rivals. The rivals were obvious: China, Venezuela's largest investor and oil buyer, and Russia, supplying critical inputs through barter. President Trump removed any remaining ambiguity during his January 3rd press conference. He framed the intervention as compensation for losses tied to Venezuela's nationalization of its oil sector. The message was unmistakable: challenge dollar dominance in energy trade, and military enforcement becomes legitimate policy. Operation Absolute Resolve was not counterterrorism, it was economic warfare conducted through naval power. Carrier strike groups, marine units, fifth-generation fighters, and thousands of troops were deployed not to fight militants, but to sever revenue streams. This wasn't about drugs or democracy, it was about oil, money, and defending a financial system that was starting to crack. Let me break down the tanker seizures step by step, because this is where the official story starts to crack. Not theory, not speculation, names, dates, coordinates, events that actually happened. It starts on December 10, 2025. A very large crude carrier, a VLCC, is intercepted off Venezuela's coast near Barcelona, roughly 10° north latitude and 64° west longitude. What made this seizure remarkable wasn't simply that the ship was boarded, it was what happened before the boarding. The tanker had deliberately altered its AIS transponder data, broadcasting a fake position near Guyana, hundreds of miles away, while it was actually anchored off Barcelona. This wasn't a technical glitch, it was deliberate camouflage in a world where tracking data itself has become a weapon. The captain was already a known figure. He had been sanctioned back in 2022 for involvement in Iranian oil shipments. The cargo being loaded was Venezuelan crude at the Jose terminal, officially listed as bound for Cuba, with an estimated arrival date of December 17th. The boarding force was anything but routine. It included an elite Coast Guard maritime security and response team, backed by Special Operations Forces, roughly 10 Marines and 10 Coast Guard personnel, with 2 U.S. Navy helicopters providing overwatch. By early January 2026, the vessel was anchored off Galveston, Texas. The oil had not yet been formally confiscated, but effective control had already changed hands. Legal process would come later. Power had already spoken. Then came December 20th, 2025, just before dawn. Another VLCC, this one Panama flagged, was intercepted in international waters east of Barbados, near 13° north and 58° west. This is where escalation stops being deniable. This ship was not under U.S. sanctions. It was carrying roughly 1 to 1.1 million barrels of Venezuelan Marais crude, headed for China. It had loaded under an alias, operating within what analysts were now openly calling Venezuela's shadow fleet. A Coast Guard tactical team boarded the vessel with Department of Defense support. Afterward, it was taken under U.S. control and sailed to Texas. Pause on that for a moment. A Panama-flagged tanker, not sanctioned, seized in international waters, not because of ownership, but because of the origin of the oil. The precedent was unmistakable and chilling. Venezuelan crude alone was now sufficient justification. This wasn't a drug interdiction. It was financial enforcement by force. Then there was the tanker that didn't submit. In late December 2025, U.S. forces attempted to intercept another vessel. On December 21st, boarding was initiated. The crew refused. When Coast Guard units closed in, the ship executed a sharp turn and fled into open waters. By January 3, 2026, tracking data showed it heading northeast across the North Atlantic, passing between Iceland and the United Kingdom toward a suspected destination near Murmansk, Russia. Its course placed it in the 60-65 grand latitude band, transiting the Iceland-UK gap. This tanker, often referenced in intelligence briefings as Bella 1, had a prior designation history linked to Iranian oil trade and operated under Russian protection. On January 2nd, one day before Operation Absolute Resolve began, Russia formally demanded that the United States halt pursuit. Venezuela dispatched naval escorts for its tankers, but this ship had not yet entered Venezuelan waters when the chase began. As of January 5, 2026, pursuit was still ongoing, with the vessel tracked toward northern Russian ports near 68° north and 30° east. Around these tanker actions, the broader military picture was taking shape. Dozens of small vessels destroyed under counter-narcotics operations, casualties rising, 2 tankers physically seized, 1 still under active pursuit. And then, just days before kinetic escalation, the financial pressure tightened again. On December 30th and 31st, 2025, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned 4 additional tankers and 6 shipping companies, owners, operators, and managers tied to Venezuelan crude shipments. The signal was unmistakable. This wasn't about a few ships, it was about strangling an entire logistics ecosystem. The economic impact was immediate and severe. In October 2025, Venezuela was producing roughly 1.13 million barrels per day and exporting around 880,000 barrels. In November, exports peaked near 921,000 barrels per day, the last high watermark before the clampdown. In early December, production and exports remained stable. Then the break came. Between December 16th and December 31st, exports collapsed to roughly 500,000 barrels per day, a nearly 46% drop in weeks. By January 2026, projections suggested exports could fall toward 200,000 barrels per day. By late December, nearly 80 tankers were idling near the Jose terminal. Storage tanks were full. Floating storage was maxed out. PDVSA was forced to shut in production at the fields to prevent cascading system failures. The only oil still moving belonged to Chevron, roughly 100,000 barrels per day, exported under special U.S. licenses. Everyone else was effectively locked out. So the central question becomes unavoidable. Was Operation Absolute Resolve really about terrorism, or was it about money? Officially, the justification rested on 3 pillars: drug trafficking, human trafficking, and the illegitimacy of the Venezuelan government. Maduro was portrayed as a narco-terror leader. Migration and gang infiltration were elevated to national security threats. U.S. recognition of an alternative president supplied legal cover. Combined with expanded executive authority and modern interpretations of hemispheric doctrine, this framework allowed military action without congressional resistance. But the De-Dollarization timeline tells a different story. Venezuela began stepping away from dollar pricing as early as 2017. By 2018, it was testing crypto and alternative settlement methods. By 2019, PDVSA explored non-SWIFT payment systems. In 2023 and 2024, USDT payments became mandatory for new oil buyers. By mid-2024, the central bank was injecting hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crypto into circulation. By December 2025, roughly 80% of oil revenue was settled in USDT. The dollar was effectively gone. Then on January 1, 2026, China activated interest-bearing digital Yuan. For the first time, an oil settlement currency didn't just store value, it generated yield. 2 days later, military force followed. If de-dollarization alone were intolerable, intervention would have come years earlier. What changed was scale, maturity, and credibility. Venezuela wasn't merely rejecting the dollar, it was demonstrating that an alternative system could function at scale. History has seen this pattern before. Iraq moved oil sales away from the dollar, invaded. Libya proposed an alternative reserve system, destroyed. Venezuela built a working post-dollar oil trade and faced intervention. Analysts recognized the pattern immediately. The conclusion was blunt: challenge dollar dominance in energy markets, and regime survival becomes conditional. The claim that Venezuela represents only 1% of global oil supply misses the real risk. The threat isn't volume, it's precedent. If the country with the world's largest proven oil reserves can operate outside the dollar using crypto, Yuan settlement, barter, and debt swaps, the template exists for much larger producers. Saudi Arabia's participation in alternative settlement testing signals openness. That alone rattles the petrodollar more than any single production figure ever could. Yes, criminal networks exist. Yes, trafficking is real. But those realities existed for decades without triggering regime-level military action. What changed was timing: peak de-dollarization, interest-bearing digital yuan, and fully operational alternative payment rails. The forensic conclusion is hard to escape. High-confidence assessment: Operation Absolute Resolve was fundamentally a petrodollar defense operation. Terrorism and narcotics narratives provided legal and public cover. The strategic objective was economic: reassert dollar dominance, disrupt China's Western Hemisphere oil corridor, and eliminate a live demonstration of post-dollar trade. And here's the irony: by using force to defend the dollar, the United States may have accelerated the global search for alternatives. The intervention exposed the risks of dollar dependence, the fragility of SWIFT, and the urgency of payment diversification. China and Russia are unlikely to retreat, they're more likely to accelerate. Which brings us back to the dates that refuse to be coincidence. January 1st, 2026. The digital yuan begins paying interest. January 3rd, 2026. A president is captured. The media sold a drug war narrative. The ledger recorded something else. The numbers don't lie. So ask yourself this: if military force was required to stop a country producing 1% of global oil from exiting the dollar system, what happens when a major producer makes the same move? The infrastructure already exists. The rails are live. The real question is no longer whether de-dollarization can happen, but whether it can be stopped. That's the real story.